By the mid-1950s, Oak Island had already claimed its place in the lore of North American history. The pit had swallowed decades of dreams, fortunes, and lives, yet its mystery remained intact. Each generation that stepped onto the island carried not only their own tools and theories, but also the weight of every failed attempt before them. The legend was now deeply etched into the soil, and with it came both reverence and danger. Among those drawn into this living riddle was a man named Robert Restall. Restall was not a millionaire or a corporate-backed syndicate leader. He was a quiet, intensely dedicated man who had spent years building mechanical equipment and contracting systems in Canada. By the late 1950s, Restall had developed a keen interest in the Oak Island mystery and believed that, with focus and precision, he might succeed where others had failed. What made his journey even more compelling was that he was not alone. He brought with him his entire family, his wife Mildred and their sons, Bobby and Richard. Together, the Restalls took up residence on Oak Island in 1959. Unlike earlier operations, the Restalls ran a humble, almost ascetic camp. They lived in modest quarters they built themselves and cooked their meals over open fires. Their tools were minimal but efficient, often handcrafted or modified by Robert himself. Their days were spent in laborious exploration, studying old maps, deciphering supposed codes carved into stones, and gradually digging shafts they hoped would connect to the elusive network of tunnels in the fabled vault. Their approach was thoughtful, grounded not in grandeur but in grit. Robert was convinced that the treasure or whatever lay beneath the island had been intentionally misdirected. He believed that the money pit was not the true location of the treasure, but a decoy. His theory proposed that an elaborate network of tunnels had been constructed to divert diggers, and that only by studying airflow patterns and pressure differentials could one determine the real site. To test this, the Restalls began using rudimentary air pressure tests. They released smoke bombs into shafts to observe where the smoke traveled. When smoke disappeared quickly or re-emerged from other holes, it suggested the presence of hidden, interconnected tunnels. Though their methods were basic, they were effective at mapping what seemed like a concealed underground web. Over several years, the Restalls uncovered numerous clues. They discovered layers of timber, hand-cut stones, and even what appeared to be strange symbols etched into rock faces. Mildred kept detailed journals of every find, and Bobby began documenting the dig on film. Their findings, while not definitive proof of treasure, added important pieces to the ever-growing puzzle. The work was grueling. Conditions on the island were harsh. Summers were hot and humid. Winters were bitterly cold. Terrain was uneven, and the deeper they dug, the more unstable the shafts became. Still, they pressed on. In 1965, their operation reached a new level of intensity. After years of planning, Robert identified a shaft location near the money pit that he believed held the key to unlocking the vault system. He began preparing it for deep excavation, reinforcing the structure and testing air quality daily. On August 17, 1965, tragedy struck. That morning, Robert descended into the shaft to inspect progress. Unbeknownst to him, a sudden and lethal buildup of hydrogen sulfide gas had formed at the bottom. Within moments of inhaling the invisible vapor, he collapsed. His son Bobby, seeing his father in distress, immediately descended after him, only to succumb to the same gas. In a frantic attempt to save them, two workers, Carl Grazer and Cyril Hiltz, also entered the shaft and were quickly overcome. In the span of minutes, 4 lives were lost. The surviving members of the crew were unable to reach the victims in time. Emergency responders later recovered the bodies. Mildred Restall, who had been documenting the day from the surface, was left to grapple with the devastating loss of her husband and son. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the Oak Island community and the wider public. For the first time in decades, the island's so-called curse became front-page news. The story was covered in Canadian and international newspapers, and for many, it confirmed what had long been whispered. Oak Island demanded a price. The legend of 7 must die before the treasure is found. Once dismissed as a folktale, was now believed by many to be terrifyingly real. With 6 known fatalities connected to the treasure hunt, belief in the curse intensified. Despite the horror, the Restall family's contribution to the Oak Island story remained profound. Their years of meticulous observation, their documented maps, and their underground smoke tests laid important groundwork for future explorers. More importantly, their devotion reminded the world that the island was not just a myth. It was a living history, filled with real people, real loss, and real heart. After the deaths, the island fell silent again. The shafts remained undisturbed for months. Stillness hung over the land as if Oak Island itself were mourning. Tourists who had once visited to see the dig site now came quietly, offering flowers, or standing in reverence by the markers left for the fallen. But even in the face of such a devastating event, the mystery did not die. Instead, it deepened. The question of what could possibly be so important, so heavily protected that it would claim the lives of those who sought it, remained unanswered. The Restall tragedy marked a turning point in Oak Island's history. From that point forward, the island would be approached not just with wonder, but with solemnity. It had proven itself to be not only a puzzle, but a peril. As the 1960s progressed, new explorers would arrive, armed with the Restall's maps and notes. The legend would grow, the curse would spread, and the world would continue to ask, what lies beneath Oak Island? What is the true cost of finding out? The year was 1965, the tragedy that had claimed 4 lives. On Oak Island, still lingered in the minds of treasure hunters and locals alike. For many, it was a warning. The mystery of the island had grown darker, the legend heavier, and the pursuit more treacherous. But for others, including a man named Dan Blankenship, the story was far from over. Dan Blankenship was a Florida-based contractor with a background in heavy machinery, logistics, and construction. He had read about the Restall tragedy in a Reader's Digest article, and rather than being deterred, he was intrigued. Something about the scale of the effort, the scope of the engineering, and the unshakable persistence of those who came before called to him. For Blankenship, Oak Island wasn't just a treasure hunt, it was a calling. By 1966, Dan Blankenship had moved to Nova Scotia with his wife and children. He poured his savings into a new round of exploration, eventually purchasing land on the island and establishing a base of operations. He studied every map, journal, and logbook he could get his hands on, particularly those from the Restall family. He viewed his efforts not as starting over, but as continuing a legacy. Blankenship was methodical. He applied military-style planning to every aspect of the dig, hired local workers, sourced heavy-duty equipment, and made safety a priority in ways his predecessors never could. More importantly, he brought something no one else had: patience. He believed that the key to unlocking the island's mystery was not found in rushing, but in persistence. His most famous endeavor began with the creation of Borehole 10X. Borehole 10X was unlike any shaft dug before, located approximately 180 feet from the original money pit. It was drilled deep into the bedrock with reinforced steel casing and concrete. Blankenship believed that earlier excavations had either collapsed the original vault or caused the island's subterranean layout to shift. He theorized that the real chamber could still be reached through this new angle. Drilling took months, complicated by unexpected water pressure and unstable bedrock. But at a depth of approximately 235 feet, Blankenship believed he had struck something remarkable: a cavern. He lowered a camera into the shaft, its images grainy and ghost-like but compelling. The footage allegedly showed hand-hewn walls, wooden beams, and what appeared to be tools or chests partially buried in sediment. Some claimed the images depicted a body draped in cloth. While the resolution was poor and skeptics argued over interpretations, the images were enough to make headlines. Oak Island was back in the public eye. Blankenship attempted to send divers into the shaft, but each descent was plagued by danger. The water was dark, the currents strong, and visibility nearly zero. One diver nearly lost his life. Despite repeated efforts, no artifacts could be retrieved. Still, Blankenship remained convinced. In the late 1960s, he partnered with David Tobias, a businessman and lawyer from Montreal, who shared his passion and brought new funding to the project. Together, they formed Triton Alliance, a company that took legal control of much of Oak Island. Their goal was to consolidate exploration, standardize documentation, and raise funds for larger-scale operations. With Triton Alliance behind him, Blankenship returned to work. Over the next 2 decades, the team drilled dozens of boreholes. Mapping the underground network in greater detail than ever before, they cataloged wood samples, metal fragments, and reports of underground cavities. Some of the boreholes produced core samples that included bits of porcelain, parchment, and metal. None of it could be confirmed as treasure, but it all suggested man-made activity. In 1973, a major find was reported. What appeared to be a large, hand-forged iron hinge or bracket retrieved from a borehole near 10X. This, along with a sample of cement-like material found at the same depth, was presented as further evidence of an underground vault. Media outlets covered the discovery, and Oak Island was once again a topic of national conversation. Despite the renewed attention, the work was slow, and the obstacles many. Funding came in waves. Legal battles over land rights and mineral claims interrupted progress. Equipment broke down. Boreholes collapsed. Yet Blankenship never gave up. He lived on Oak Island year-round. His home was humble but functional, filled with maps, core samples, and handwritten logs. His office was a war room of data cross-sections of tunnels, chemical analysis reports, and photos from every dig. Visitors often noted that he spoke of Oak Island not as a place, but as a presence, something alive, something sacred. In interviews, Blankenship spoke about the cost of his pursuit. He had spent decades of his life and much of his fortune digging in the same soil that had buried so many others. He had suffered physical setbacks, including a serious injury after falling from a platform, and yet he always returned to the same refrain: "I believe." Blankenship's story is not one of discovery but of dedication. He didn't find the treasure, but he helped define the era. He brought stability to the search. He documented everything. He respected the island. And perhaps most importantly, he passed the torch. By the late 1980s, Dan Blankenship was aging. His once young face was lined with salt and sun. His walk had slowed, but his focus had not. He welcomed visitors, reporters, and even skeptics, offering them tours of the boreholes and showing them samples. He knew not everyone would believe. That was fine. He believed enough for them all. Meanwhile, David Tobias handled the business side of Triton Alliance. He negotiated contracts, managed disputes, and explored new funding options. Together, he and Blankenship maintained control of exploration rights through a mix of persistence and legal resilience. By 1990, Oak Island had seen its share of tragedies and triumphs, though never the final prize. Blankenship, like those before him, stood at the edge of the unknown, shovel in hand, undeterred. In many ways, Dan Blankenship became the heart of Oak Island. He embodied its spirit, tough, enduring, quiet, and enigmatic. He didn't need to find gold to justify his journey. The pursuit itself was enough. He had turned the island into his life's work, and that work had meaning. He once said, "Even if I never find it, someone will. Maybe not today, maybe not in my lifetime, but it's there. I know it." For those who listened to him, those words carried weight. They were not just the dreams of another fortune seeker. They were the testament of a man who had given everything in search of truth. Still, the pit waited. As the 1970s unfolded, Oak Island's allure expanded beyond the isolated coastline of Nova Scotia. What had once been a quiet local obsession had become a national story and, soon after, a global one. This transformation was due in part to the expanding reach of media and technology, but also to the simple fact that the mystery refused to be solved. And with every year it remained unanswered, it grew larger in the public imagination. Television played a major role in that growth. The first major documentary-style program on Oak Island aired in 1979, produced by a Canadian broadcaster. The special featured grainy footage from Dan Blankenship's Borehole 10X, interviews with treasure hunters past and present, and dramatic reenactments of the Restall tragedy. For many viewers, it was their first encounter with the money pit, and it left a lasting impression. The program was a ratings success, sparking renewed public interest and a flood of letters to local historical societies and media outlets. Soon, articles appeared in Reader's Digest, National Geographic, and even international publications. Oak Island had become more than a legend. It was now a living mystery, fed by film reels and broadcast waves. With that exposure came a surge in public speculation. Authors began publishing books filled with theories, many drawing connections between Oak Island and global historical events. One camp suggested the treasure belonged to the Knights Templar, who allegedly fled persecution in Europe with sacred relics and vast wealth, eventually hiding it in the New World. Others claimed the island was a repository for Shakespeare's lost manuscripts, hidden by Francis Bacon as part of a secret society's agenda. Some theories reached even further, suggesting ancient Phoenician explorers, pre-Columbian contact, or buried proof of extraterrestrial visitations. The further the truth seemed, the more elaborate the ideas became. Dan Blankenship, for his part, welcomed the attention, but remained grounded. He did not endorse grand conspiracy theories, though he respected the imagination they inspired. He continued his work, quietly mapping the island and trying to improve upon earlier dig efforts. In 1983, Blankenship and David Tobias published a comprehensive report outlining all known finds and borehole results up to that point. The document, known in Oak Island circles simply as the Triton Files, became the most detailed repository of exploration data available at the time. It was circulated among engineers, investors, and even universities, but still no treasure. Interest from the media didn't always translate into financial support. Several planned excavations in the 1980s were delayed or canceled due to lack of funding. Digging was expensive. Shafts collapsed frequently. Equipment had to be replaced. And legal challenges from neighboring landowners or former shareholders became increasingly common. In 1989, a New York film crew visited Oak Island to create a special for American cable television. Their footage included dramatic shots of the island's barren landscape, old rusted equipment, and stormy coastlines. They interviewed Blankenship in his modest office, surrounded by core samples and faded photographs. The program aired the following year and introduced Oak Island to an entirely new audience. This new wave of interest also reignited tension between skepticism and belief. Critics argued that 100 years of digging had produced nothing of substance, no treasure, no artifacts of proven historical value, and no confirmed vault. They called it a mass delusion. Supporters countered with evidence of man-made engineering. Non-aid materials like coconut fiber and borehole samples of parchment, cement, and hand-wrought iron. They insisted that these weren't natural coincidences, but deliberate constructs pointing to something important, still hidden underground. During this period, Oak Island began to attract not just treasure hunters, but archivists, academics, and amateur historians. Libraries began collecting Oak Island documents. University students wrote theses on the sociological aspects of the mystery. Teachers used the story as a case study in critical thinking and logic. In 1995, a public access documentary titled Oak Island: The Unfinished Dig aired on Canadian television. It was slower paced than earlier productions, focusing less on drama and more on historical accuracy. It featured aerial shots of the island, interviews with researchers, and a timeline of key events. One of the documentary's most powerful moments came during a segment with Dan Blankenship. Asked what kept him going after so many years, he responded, "It's not about gold. It's about answers." That quote would appear in multiple publications in the years to come. Summed up what Oak Island had become: a pursuit of meaning, of closure, of understanding something bigger than any single person or object. But time was catching up. By the late 1990s, many of the original diggers were aging or had passed on. Legal control of various sections of the island was increasingly complex. New players emerged, some with fresh ideas, others seeking profit from the growing interest in the mystery. Tensions occasionally arose between the long-standing Triton Alliance and newcomers interested in commercialization. Offers were made for TV rights, book deals, and even theme park-style experiences. Blankenship resisted anything he felt disrespected the seriousness of the work. His vision was simple: solve the mystery, preserve the history, and do it with integrity. And though the heavy digging slowed, research continued. Private archives were scanned. Geological data was reanalyzed with new software. Drone footage was used to map terrain. In many ways, the 1990s were less about digging and more about thinking. Reevaluating past assumptions, revisiting old boreholes, and planning for what would come next. Oak Island had transitioned from an excavation site to a historical institution. It was no longer about one man or one theory. It was about a community of people, spanning generations and borders, dedicated to solving one of the oldest and most haunting mysteries in the Western world. And still, the pit waited. As the final years of the 20th century approached, Oak Island stood as a monument to human obsession. No longer just a place of whispered secrets or bold engineering, it had evolved into a symbol, an enigma that echoed through generations. And by the year 2000, the question remained the same as it had been in 1795. What lies beneath? In the wake of the 1990s media coverage and the rise of the documentary format, the island's story became more accessible than ever before. But this accessibility brought something new: reverence. More than curiosity or greed, those drawn to the island now often spoke of honoring those who came before them. Among these voices were the descendants of Oak Island's most prominent figures. The children and grandchildren of men like Robert Restall and Dan Blankenship had grown up in the shadow of the mystery. They knew the cost. They had heard the stories not from books or screens, but from family dinner tables and quiet conversations under flickering porch lights. Rick Restall, son of Robert and brother to Bobby, occasionally gave interviews recounting the years he spent on the island before the tragedy. He remembered the hand-dug shafts, the homemade winches, and the endless discussions his father had about tunnel angles and trap designs. For him, the island was not a fantasy, it was a memory. Mildred Restall, Robert's widow, preserved her husband's journals and notes with quiet dignity. She declined most interview requests, preferring to let the records speak for themselves. But in one rare public statement, she said Bob believed it was there. That was enough for him. It's still enough for me. Dan Blankenship, aging but resolute, continued to reside on the island. His body had slowed, but his mind had not. He worked with local historical groups, kept up correspondence with geologists and engineers, and continued exploring leads. He also opened the island to small groups of researchers and documentary crews, providing guided tours and sharing samples from past digs. Even in his later years, Blankenship could be seen walking the trails of Oak Island, pausing to look over old boreholes and adjusting stakes that marked key grid points. It was his cathedral, and he its lifelong caretaker. But beyond personal stories, the mystery deepened in the collective imagination. By the end of the century, the legend of Oak Island had evolved into something bigger than any one treasure. It had become a modern myth, a story not just about gold or secrets, but about the human spirit, the perseverance, the wonder, the refusal to let go of a question, even when every rational mind would suggest otherwise. The so-called curse of Oak Island now seemed as much metaphor as menace. 7 must die before the treasure is found, the legend claimed, and as of the year 2000, 6 men had. Some interpreted this as a dire omen. Others saw it as symbolic, representing the ultimate sacrifice demanded by the search for truth. Yet not all consequences were fatal. Many who worked on the island spoke of sleepless nights, of dreams haunted by tunnels, maps, and water traps. Some suffered financial losses, investing all they had into expeditions that ended in silence. Others strained family ties, their obsession with the island pulling them away from home, from comfort, from stability. But for every hardship, there was also meaning. Families bonded over the legend. Fathers and sons camped beneath the stars, listening to the waves slap against the shore as they speculated about buried ships or secret societies. School children wrote essays about the coconut fiber. Elderly locals told tales in pubs about the time they helped dig shaft number 6 or saw smoke rise from the money pit. Oak Island had become part of the cultural fabric of Nova Scotia and beyond. In 1999, a time capsule of sorts was buried near the original money pit site. Organized by a group of researchers and locals, it contained documents, photos, predictions, and letters from descendants of past explorers. The idea was that one day, perhaps 100 years in the future, a new generation would open it and understand the weight of the journey. It was a quiet gesture. No cameras, no fanfare. Just a handful of people standing beneath a gray sky, sealing a box of memories beneath the earth that had resisted them for over 2 centuries. As the clock ticked into the year 2000, Oak Island was quiet. No major digs were underway, no new discoveries had made headlines, but the silence was not defeat. It was anticipation. The mystery had not been solved, but it had not been abandoned either, and for many, that was enough. Blankenship once told a reporter, "I think it's not the treasure that keeps people coming, it's the chase." The dream that something incredible might still be found. That's what keeps it alive. And alive, it remained. By the dawn of the new millennium, Oak Island stood untouched by modern convenience. It had no paved roads, no glowing signs, no tourist shops, just dirt, water, stone, and memory. And somewhere beneath it all, the truth still slept.